Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pai Sho Podcast. I'm Dallin, and I'm here with my co-host Sambews, and today we're being joined by Cannoli. Hello, Cannoli.
Hello, hello.
So, what's today's episode about, Sambews?
Today, in kind of to coincide with the upcoming Skud beginner tournament, we're talking about Skud strategy.
That's right. And who better to have to talk about Skud strategy with than, the ultimate Skud strategy person himself, Cannoli.
I'm flattered, absolutely flattered.
The honorary tournament winner.
The honorary tournament winner. I'm
You got so close.
currently in a game with the actual tournament winner.
Everyone's in a game with Gyatso. They take 2 months.
That's fair, that's fair. It's strange to think that my games with him are probably the faster ones, where they only last a week or so.
It's a miracle we were able to get that tournament round done as fast as we did.
Oh, absolutely.
So, some background on why we have Cannoli here. I'd say Cannoli's probably, everybody sees him in the community as the guy who can teach people anything they would need to know about starting out with Skud or strategy with Skud and becoming a master with Skud. He just he leads newcomers along and is able to show them how strategy really works in this game.
I definitely learned Skud from Cannoli.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's very much one of the things I love about this game is being able to teach newer players and to sort of bring them in. And I find that, especially when playing newer players, it's not just teaching them, but also learning from them myself, because a lot of times you'll find that people who have played for a long time have a harder time sort of experimenting with someone new. It's always about sort of trying what they already
Following
know.
this,
And
sticking to the tried and true.
the newer players tend to be the ones that, bring a ton of experimental ideas in. They're not always necessarily good ideas, but every once in a while you'll get something that's totally unique, and it's part of the reason that I enjoy teaching newer players so much.
I totally agree with that. It's a lot of times people who have been in the community for a while will have this style, this flow of playing that they've learned from other people that they just kind of stick with every time.
It's almost like
But
a
then-
formula.
Yeah, like a formula. But then newcomers come in, they're oh, what if I just do this and this? This should work, right? And then sometimes it's a terrible idea, and then sometimes it's awesome, whoa, that's actually a really good point. I remember, I think my 3-5 strategy that I like to stick with a lot today, I came up with as a newcomer, just kind of I guess this works, and then it really got me far in a lot of tournaments.
And now that's the most used opening.
Yeah, I definitely adapted that 3-5 for my own sort of purposes, and then...
And you made it way better, too.
And then everybody copied you.
Yeah, and then it started turning into a 3-5-4 thing where people would put out a willy as well. Anyway, it's a whole thing.
The meta of the game is very interesting.
Yeah. I've seen newcomers oftentimes who'll experiment. I remember I was watching a game from a newcomer recently. He was like, I wonder what happened if I did 5-5, and he put a white jade in and then a rhododendron in. And I'm like, that's a good idea experimenting, but that doesn't really, that might not be the best idea to start with that. So, yeah, they just have lots of new ideas they bring to the table.
I think that's a good segue into talking about openings.
Yeah, so
Right.
if you are indeed one of the newcomers we're talking about, hopefully you haven't been discouraged from us sort of talking about the game from our perspectives. We're here to sort of bring some perspective to you on sort of basic strategy. Not exactly, oh, you should absolutely play this way, but little tips that'll get you thinking in the right direction and creating your own sort of playstyle. And so I think we're gonna start with when we talk about 3-5 openings, what do we mean? We are assuming that you have read the rulebook at least once, possibly multiple times. It takes a little bit to get used to.
And it's not just reading the rule book either. It's playing a few games before you actually understand how everything works. But
Yes.
yeah, it does take a few times through the rule book to get a grasp on it. And the rule book, where can they find the rules? There's a few places they can find them, right? It's on the website. If you go new, and then you see under Skud that has a rules link, and that'll bring you to it. And there's instructional videos on YouTube for it as well. And yeah, there's all kinds of places you can figure out the rules to Skud Pai Sho. Okay, as you were saying, Cannoli, sorry.
So, assuming you have read the rulebook, we will begin talking about openers. What we're talking about when we say 3-5, 4-5. And essentially what that means is, what are the first 2 tiles you put on the board? Or, more broadly, what are the first 2 moves you make? So, each game starts with the guest planting a tile, and the host has to plant the same one in the opposite gate. And then from there, the game starts, and players are sort of free to do what they want. The 2 most common strategies you'll see are a 3-5 and a 4-5, where the guest, so the guest decides what the first one is. So say they'll plant a 3, and then plant a 5 in an adjacent gate, and so the host, depending on what the first tile is planted, generally responds with the same strategy, but there is some variation.
And sometimes, like, they'll plant a 5 in the bottom, and since a 5 can be used for a 3-5 and a 4-5, the host can kind of pick either one.
You'll see both strategies used in the same game, or both openings.
Yeah, oftentimes if the 5 is the first tile, you can get both openings used in the same game. And then, like, an example for anybody still confused, for a 3-5, rose moves 3 spaces, white jade moves 5 spaces. You put a rose in the bottom and a white jade in a different gate. And for a 4-5, like, a chrysanthemum moves 4 and a rhododendron moves 5. So you put, like, a chrysanthemum in the bottom or a rhododendron in the bottom. Basically, you'd put a 3 moving tile in and a 5 moving tile in for a 3-5, and 4-5 is likewise. So continue, Cannoli.
Something important to note is, I'm sure 3-5 and 4-5 are, they can carry the game, and players can do very well with only using those 2, or even just one of them,
and I think,
which a lot of players do.
It's a very, very large, like 90% of the games I play are against one of those 2. You very rarely see something else.
Yeah. But what is important to note is that you are not restricted to just using one or the other. They are the most popular, but they're not necessarily the most viable. And it really just depends on how you like to play. So it's good to experiment with those 2 and with what seems interesting to you. What I have hastily dubbed the X-Rush opening, where you plant your first tile as guest, and then instead of planting a second tile, you just move out, is something I actually see a lot. I especially saw it a lot in sort of my first days of playing Pai Sho. You'll see, as I think we mentioned earlier, the 5-5 opening, or a 3-3 opening, which is very common as a response to 3-5 for the host. And so, while it's important to sort of know, okay, what is the most popular, don't be afraid to experiment with your own sort of openings.
Like, hasn't Yaglo done a 3-4? I think I don't quite remember, but I think I might have lost.
He does 3-4, and he actually does 3'4, where the 3 is the opposite color of the 4.
Oh. How does that... Okay, I'm trying to imagine that.
It's very much in the vein of a 3-5, where the sort of resulting shape resembles that. but it's a more gate control based strategy.
That kind of makes sense though, because with the 3-5 strategy that's been developed by, I think I was the first one to kind of use my favorite strategy for 3-5. People have started using the opposite color 4 in there because it harmonizes with the with the 5. And so I'm kind of starting to see how that would work. That's very interesting.
And so that's like the 3-5-4 opening, right? Which apparently was the meta just before I joined, so I didn't get to see much of that.
Oh, interesting.
But apparently that was a big thing.
Yeah.
Yes. That was the 3-5-4 was something I had actually been doing for a bit, but was trying to sort of hide before the tournament. But I brought it out during the tournament. Other people had found it on their own, namely Yagalo, used it a lot. But it's seen some pickup, but the main trade-off there, if you're interested about that, is that the 4 tends to be on a quadrant where it isn't the same color as the garden in that quadrant, and so it's hard to sort of maneuver it around.
Right. That does get a little rough. But the nice thing is it also moves 4, and yeah, that makes it so it has a bit more available spots that it can move to.
And my take and the way I explain the difference between the 4-5 and 3-5 is 4-5 is a lot stronger early game because it moves faster and you can form your ring earlier. But 3-5
Right.
is much stronger late game because the tiles have a much more flexibility and they're easier to block. Or more difficult to block.
I've noticed that.
Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, when I go for 4-5, it's like I have this strong thing, like, oh man, I can make a ring. But then like the game gets more complicated and all of a sudden I just have less options available and things get harder. So yeah. Let's move on to like the tempo of the game.
Yes, Skud is very tempo based. It's very flowy.
Yeah, so
Yes.
you won't be starting out with the same sort of advantages as guest and host. I wouldn't say it's lopsided as in one has the advantage over the other if you know how to play both, but what you'll generally find is that the guest has a speed advantage. They get to move first, but the host has gate control advantage, where the guest has to move first, so they have to give up a gate earlier if they're playing that way. So generally you will want to play with defense in mind at the beginning as host, and you don't usually want to play defensively as guest. These are more guidelines than rules, and there are many situations where very clearly you can break them, but the general consensus is that you'll probably be safer playing that way.
So guest has speed advantage, host has a gate advantage. And then the question is, because if you're starting as host and you're playing defensively, usually in Skud you don't want to be playing defensively. But
This is correct, yeah.
You're kind of forced to when you're host. Oftentimes it's a good way to play. How do you change that? How do you change that for you so that you're the one with the advantage rather than your opponent?
So the main way to, I guess, obtain the advantage and be playing more offensively is to set up as much offensively as you can. Don't play strict defense, because you'll find that you will quickly fall far behind. And what you want to do instead is use your accent tiles. Accent tiles can be used on a harmony bonus, which means you can be
offensive and defensive in the same turn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now do keep in mind that you don't want to just use your accent tiles willy-nilly. Not just because your accent tiles are limited, but also there's a trade-off when you use one. Basically, if you are using an accent tile on a harmony bonus where you could be planting a flower in a gate, you are making a defensive move in place of where you could be pressing more on offense. So usually as host, and as guest as well, you want to wait until you absolutely have to use an accent tile, or if you, at least until you can't plant in a gate anyway.
And I think one example of this was, in one of the recent tournament games, Gyatso versus Momo, didn't it go like 20 turns without a single accent tile being played?
It did, it did.
That was really intense, because both of them didn't want to lose that advantage that they had by having all of their accent tiles still.
Exactly.
And then before, I think the rules have been changed for alternate win conditions, but before they were, it used to be that, like, once all tiles were put out of the game for one player, whoever had the most accent tiles won the game, right? Was that
correct? It is no longer like that. There was a strategy discovered that abused it. That's a whole nother story. It was a whole event. But now the alternate win conditions are: if one player plays plants their last basic tile, the game ends, and whoever has the most harmonies crossing midlines wins the game. It is important to note, and I didn't actually realize this until I lost a game because of it, that harmonies on a midline and crossing a midline do not count as midline harmonies. Generally, you won't find yourself in alternate win conditions unless you're up against someone who you're, like, very evenly matched against, or who's incredibly good at defense.
Gyatso.
Or you just
Gyatso.
Both have no idea what you're doing.
If their name is Gyatso, expect it. If you can last that long. But it's important to note that it is no longer accent tiles, so do not be afraid to use your accent tiles, especially the defensive ones. It's good to have them. I know some people who play two-wheel, two-boat. I used to play like that. I would advise that you pick at least one defensive one.
My personal rule for gaining tempo is I try and make a move that it takes me less turns to make that defensive play than it does for them to undo it. And then in those turns while they're undoing it, and with the turn advantage that I've generated, I can start playing offensively.
For instance, a really good placement for a rock I've noticed is you put the rock in a place oftentimes that doesn't even block any harmonies immediately, but instead you put it where your opponent wants to put their final tile of a ring, which
you put it in like the corner.
Yeah, you put it in the corner there, and it sets them back like a few moves.
This does dip in a bit to just basic early game Skud strategy, which I think we want to move on to. So what should you be doing in the early game besides trying to even the play fields if you're host and trying to keep that from happening as guest? Like, how exactly do you do that?
My experience has been you want to get lots of tiles out, because that means you have more tiles to block harmonies as host, and you have more tiles to forward harmonies, and you can like play for multiple rings as guest.
And it's like, you want to get lots of tiles out, but at the same time, you want to do it in a smart way, because there's a very large advantage in being able to put in new tiles into the game with a harmony bonus, but you can only do that when you don't already have any tiles in any of the gates.
So you don't want to like shoot yourself in the foot by planting a tile that you won't need, and then it just sits in the gate and you can't form new tiles that you want.
And something especially important to consider for this is, a lot of times what I will see is people read the rulebook and they see rules about tiles that can capture each other, which is pretty neat. Only clashing tiles can capture each other, which means that if you plant a tile that clashes with your opponent's tile in a gate, you can threaten to capture their tile and force them to move. Something important to consider is that your opponent might just move out of the way, and it might be in a spot that still helps them. If you are pushing them in a direction they want to go, all of a sudden, they have a better position, and now you're stuck with a tile on a gate that you can't use. You can't use it to harmonize with anything. It's just sort of sitting there. So you want to be careful about threatening captures.
I've run into that problem so many times, and I've seen my opponents run into it so many times. And a lot of times, like, I play people who the entire time they're just trying to figure out how they can capture my tiles. And you need to remember that Skud is not chess, it's not Vagabond, it's not centered around capturing. And
it's more positioning.
Yeah, it's more positioning.
And capturing can be very useful, and any game with Yagalo is evidence of that, but it shouldn't be your main focus.
Right. Someone who hasn't been around a while, but that I do want to mention, is a player named Timeload. They were one of the first players of Skud Pai Sho, and they returned for a little bit a couple months back. They were
doing like AI stuff, right?
Yes, but I actually want to talk about their strategy in relation to capturing. They actually had a very, very good sort of method of using those, planting a tile and gate to threaten a capture. The difference that sort of put them ahead of other players who were just sort of trying to threaten a capture and not really realizing what was happening is that there was always a secondary purpose to that plant. If the person moved out of the way of a capture, there was something else that Timeload could do with that tile, whether it be forming a harmony or setting up something else. It was never a wasted tile if it didn't have its intended purpose. And I think, especially as you get better at the game and you start figuring out how you like to play,
doing one thing with one turn is inefficient.
Yeah. Always expect your opponent to spot whatever you're trying to do. If they prove you wrong and they don't spot it,
then great.
That's good for you. But if they do expect it, then you have set yourself up, essentially, to keep on going and not lose any momentum.
Right. And Skud, it's important in Skud, like you mentioned, that you can't plan on them not seeing this thing that you can do in the next move, because Skud shouldn't be something that you like try to hope that they don't see something within the next move. It's something that you need to be able to see multiple moves ahead, like you have to be able to look very far into the game, and that's why you need to have a good plan in the beginning of the game, so you can see what you're gonna do that they can't see right now, because oftentimes people will be able to see a win condition, and oftentimes we'll be able to stop it if it's just one move ahead. But if you're thinking a few moves ahead, you can make it so that they won't be able to stop it when you set up that win condition, and that's a really important thing to remember when playing Skud Pai Sho.
Yeah, one of the things that Skud doesn't have that chess does is you don't have to force a checkmate. You can very much rely on basically cluttering the board up enough to where your opponent just won't spot something.
That's almost all of my losses.
That's true.
But then I just didn't notice it.
Oh yeah.
And that tends to be how most games end. However, playing expecting that you're sneakier or smarter than your opponent will only get you so far. And while, making sneaky moves will help you quite a bit as a beginner, it did so for me and a lot of other people. As you get better at the game and as, your friends get better at the game, you'll want to have backup plans ready.
That's true. And I mentioned earlier that a way to get a few moves ahead of your opponent is to have a plan in mind. And this is important in the beginning of the game, because you guys mentioned, if you're just doing one thing with one move, then you're wasting moves. But in the beginning of the game, that's all you can do. You can only move a tile out, and
So you want to start setting up so that you can do multiple things later on.
exactly. You need to make sure that you have a plan in mind. And in order to do that, you need to understand the different chains of harmonies that can be created by different tiles. And you need to make a plan for what your chain and eventual ring will look like before you even put any tiles on the board.
And I think this is actually something I don't think we properly touched on, sort of the merits and downsides of 3-5 versus 4-5, the two most popular openings, is that 4-5 used to be, and still is, pretty prominent because it is the fastest opening. Basically, it is the quickest way to form a harmony and get another tile out. It only takes, let's see, so 2 plants and 2 moves, so 4 moves total on your part to form that first harmony.
Right.
3-5 is 1 move slower, however, whereas 4-5 uses 2 tiles of the same color, meaning you only have access to half of the colored gardens. 3-5 grants you access to the entire board. So while it's slower, it's more dynamic, and planting that 3 first is usually very important because it means that you're also forcing your opponent to use it as well, putting you on the same foot and making sure that you're not moving slower than they are.
I think the person who uses the 4-5 opening the most today, in my experience, is Pavoni. And I once led a 5 against them as guest, and they just immediately had tempo because they played the 4-5. And it was almost like now I was playing host.
Yeah.
Because I played the slower opening.
And an interesting thing to mention is with 3-5, you can technically get your first harmony 4 moves into the game, I believe. It's just, it's kind of, you do that by kind of doing a version of the 4-5 usual strategy, but with 3-5, so they can't actually move as much. So I've seen a lot of people do that, and from my experience, it doesn't work quite as well as they expect it to work. So
it does not work.
Usually it's best when you're using 3-5, it's best to take advantage of your ability to get into the gates and into the center, not the gates, into the different zones, into different parts of the board, into the center. It's just really good to take advantage of that, because if you try to play a 3-5 like a 4-5, it often does not work very well. And I feel like we've kind of covered basic Scud strategy and like thinking about chains of harmonies and all that. And we briefly touched on accent tiles earlier, but how about we dive a little bit more into that? We talked about how accent tiles like work really well as doing 2 things in 1 move, acting offensively and defensively in the same move. But the question is like, what are each specific accent tile good for,
So I and a lot of others now play with an even spread of accent tiles, 1 of each, just because I like to have the sort of every option available. You have the rock, which can't be moved by a wheel, and blocks harmonies along the line. You have a wheel, which I would consider pretty essential, at least to my playstyle and to most people's playstyles, offensively, as, the last move to win. And usually you don't want to use a wheel defensively if you don't have to. I know there are many players who actually rely on a boat instead as that sort of last line of offense. Gyatso does it often, and I believe Hisoka does it from time to time. The boat, the key difference between the two offensively is the wheel can move something out of the way without taking its place and blocking that same line. Whereas the boat...
And it can also move something into the way as well.
That's true. The boat, on the other hand, will take the place of the tile that it moves, unless it's an accent tile, in which case both will just disappear off the board. However, the boat can move tiles diagonally, which some players do prefer. But, and then of course there's overlap where the boat can just move a tile to the side, as can a wheel. I find that the boat, out of the boat and the wheel, if you're forced to use one defensively, the boat tends to be more useful because it can get in the way and move something.
Yeah.
But usually you'll want to use a rock and a knot, or a knotweed. And then knotweed's the last one I don't think I've touched on. It's my personal favorite defensive accent tile, because you can put it in the way of something in a way that just prevents it from forming harmonies with anything. It's very good for trapping someone in the early game and sort of checkmating them in a sense. And it's good for just slowing down the tempo of the game too, which is nice.
I've noticed the knotweed often does well when there's a ring that involves tiles that are very close to each other, so really close to like a midline, because then it can shut down both of them. It also just completely shuts down lotuses often because they can only move 2 spaces, and it's hard for them to get a harmony or to get out of the way of the knotweed. Although I'm not sure if I can really talk with knotweeds because I never use them. My favorite combination of accent tiles is usually a wheel, a rock, and 2 boats.
My take on the tiles are this. So rock is good for blocking potential harmonies, and like we talked about earlier, putting it in a corner. The knotweed is best against tiles that have limited movement, and that can either mean naturally, so against like tiles that can only move 3, or by nature of their position, so like 4s or 5s, but that are in quadrants of the opposite color, and so they have less, they're more restricted in their movement, or restricted by tiles that are already out, so like they could move away from it in this direction, but that place is already blocked by one of your rocks or other tiles. And those are the kind of defensive tiles. And then boat kind of has an overlap. It can be used defensively, and it's also good. I see the boat used most effectively not when it's being used to immediately win, but when it's being used to get rid of an accent tile, and then now you're threatening to win by like a lot. Like you got rid of a major threat that is maybe a knotweed or a boat. Or knotweed or a rock, and then the wheel I almost always see as that's the last move you make is with the wheel.
Definitely.
And boats can be used as final moves, but wheels often do better with that. And I think wheels are pretty bad at being used as a defensive tile. They can be used if you're desperate, but I think other than the fact that they're pretty bad at being used as a defensive tile, they're really good at being used as your final move. So that's why you really want to keep the wheel handy, because it can be very useful. It could be something as simple as just moving a tile out of the way of a harmony, and since the boat can't do that because it would get in the way of the harmony, the wheel's able to stay outside of that. But it can also do like the craziest things. We've seen some very intense games with the wildest wheel endings because they can like move these things out of the way and this thing into there that you don't even see that coming. It's just it has so
and
many
I will often
possibilities.
Forfeit before I use a defensive wheel.
And just to really represent the awesome power of the wheel, I think I'm gonna put up on the screen right now in the final editing of the podcast
In post, of course.
In post, the Wheel of Harmony, because the Wheel of Harmony is so beautiful. it's not even that like actually useful for winning a game, but
it's very difficult to go for.
Right. But it just really demonstrates the awesome power that a wheel has, because it moves 4 different tiles at the same time, making 4 harmonies all at the same time, and yeah, just makes it so that you have no harmonies to 4 in one move, and finishes off a ring, which is just really cool. What's next? Oh, we should talk about the phases of the game. So, the phases of the game, this is something that I've thought about a lot about. I'm not sure. Have you guys really put much thought into like the phases of the game? They're like mostly 3 phases.
I haven't really. I could maybe come up with something off the top of my head, but I haven't put much thought into it.
I've got a pretty solid mental system for it.
Right.
Of just, early game, mid game, late game. It's not super descriptive, but it's a good way of sort of assessing how far in you are.
Right.
The early game is those, first 10 or so moves. You're getting tiles on the board, you're setting up initial rings. You still really kind of need accent tiles to properly block someone. It's not impossible to block with basic tiles, but it messes with your tempo if you do. The mid-game is a little later on. Generally this happens in the mid-teens of rounds. Basically, both players at this point can reliably block time and time again using only basic tiles. Most defensive accent tiles have been used at this point, and each player will more than definitely have 4 flower tiles out on the board. And then the late game is most flower tiles have been played. It's before either player really would start going for alternate conditions, but the board has been cluttered enough to where it's a possible option. Most accent tiles have been used. Usually each player will only have a wheel left. And it's very much a you know it when you see it sort of thing. It's
right.
Very cluttered. These don't happen every single game. One significant damper on that sort of definition of stuff of how many tiles are out and the like of that is wild orchids that can capture, and you'll see round 30 and there are only 12 tiles on the board because everything else has been
I think we should probably talk about special flower tiles after this, because I don't think we've touched on that much.
Definitely.
That's very true, yeah.
Sometimes you'll see games where one player has blocked all 4 gates, and there have been 20 full rounds where nothing has really happened because nobody's been putting out
That's my
any
patented
tiles.
Sambews cross thunder split attack strategy. I got it against Gyatso once and
Of
messed
course. Yeah, very, very aptly named. Gyatso has been doing that
And
for a very long time.
Props to
It
Abba
was
for
his
naming that.
sort of way of... Yeah, it was his way of when he still went for the Wheel of Harmony every single game. Basically, once he had enough tiles out, he would block every single gate if possible. I actually learned from him about gate blocking when somebody else has a tile on the gate, where you just kind of prevent them from moving out to a good spot, and so they're kind of stuck there. But that was his sort of way of trying to be able to go for the Wheel of Harmony. But yeah, you'll see irregular games, but the majority of them will fall into that early, mid, late game, and it's sort of predictable of what kind of play you'll see in each.
Right. What's interesting about these 3 phases of the game is the game could end in any one of these phases. It can end within the first 10 moves of the game if you have someone... This usually happens when you have someone who knows what they're doing more than the opponent doesn't. The opponent doesn't really know what they're doing as much, and they kind of just pull out a quick win. But then in the second phase, there can be some usually wins that happen there are kind of the sneaky wins that we were talking about when the opponent just doesn't see it because there's so many tiles on the board. It's so hard to see what your opponent can do, and then they'll pull out a wheel and it'll do some crazy thing, and then yeah. So that's what's interesting about those, is the game could end in any one of those phases. And you guys mentioned gate control. I feel like that would be another good thing to briefly cover, because gate control isn't just something that could happen later in the game. It's something you could do in the very beginning when you know someone needs one more tile to finish off their ring, and the best place to put it would be this one gate, and then you just keep a tile there. It really can just slow them down very significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's even the Orchid, which can move 6 spaces at a time, and it is the tile that can move the fastest, takes multiple turns to get all the way across the board. So controlling a gate and basically preventing your opponent from planting somewhere that they could actually quickly get their ring can be very useful in slowing them down, especially as host, where you don't want them to go faster. It's incredibly useful.
Right. And we're going to talk about special flower tiles as well.
Yes, so there are 2 special flower tiles, the Orchid and the Lotus.
And they go hand in hand. I think
they do. Often they do, yes. The Lotus is the slowest moving tile, can only move 2 spaces at a time, but it can harmonize with any basic flower tile on the board, including your opponent's. And so it's very useful on its own for, say, you're out of a basic flower tile, and there's no way you can continue your harmony ring. You can bring out a Lotus to sort of skip the sequence a little bit. It's also mainly used as a way to threat a wild Orchid. So the Orchid is the other special flower tile. No matter what, any tile that it is next to when it is out of a gate, if it is next to one of your opponent's tiles, that tile cannot move on its own. It's trapped. Additionally, once your Lotus is also out, the Orchid can capture any flower tile, but it can also be captured by any flower tile. So it's sort of a glass cannon sort of thing. Another thing to note about these 2 flower tiles is that normally on a harmony bonus, if you already have a flower in a gate, you cannot plant another. You can plant a special flower tile, so gate control is helped very much by being able to use those 2 tiles to keep a gate even if you already have another gate.
And often I'll kind of just use those tiles, I'll put them into the game without even wanting to use them right then at that moment of the game exactly for what they're used for. Sometimes I'll just use them for gate control because they work so well for that. So yeah, it's an interesting concept.
One thing that's important to note is their mobility. Right, because the Lotus can only move 2 spaces, so it is very slow, very susceptible to being Knotweeded, and so you shouldn't really rely on.
Yeah, accent tile tip: use the Knotweed on slower tiles because it is harder for them to get out of the way.
Right.
And conversely, the Orchid can move 6 tiles or 6 spaces, so it has the highest mobility in the game.
And in that way you can kind of be able to capture any basic flower tile without them being able to capture you, but the move before, because you have that distance. Although then things get tricky when your opponent has their Orchid out. Your opponent's Orchid can capture your Orchid either when they have their Lotus out or you have your Lotus out, because when you have your Lotus out, it gives your Orchid both the ability to capture any flower tile and to be captured by any flower tile. So it's often actually a strategy to not put your Lotus out, but have your Orchid, and then your opponent has their Lotus out and their Orchid. Your Orchid is kind of protected from your opponent's tiles capturing it, but you can still capture their orchids. That's an interesting way of playing there.
Definitely.
And I think the Orchid, I don't know, it's like the Orchid is either a very good defensive tile or a very good offensive tile, depending on whether or not you have the Lotus out. So kind of like two modes you can play it as.
Right.
I'd say in either case, it's definitely a defensive tile, because you're capturing opponent's flowers, you're slowing down their ability to form a ring, and yes, their ability to defend, but for the most part, you aren't progressing your own ring while you're using a wild orchid or a normal orchid. However, it can be, played more or less aggressively.
It can also be used offensively when it gets rid of a tile that's in the middle of one of your harmonies or something like that.
Yeah,
So that was a pretty good point.
And another concept I'd like to cover with the Orchid is something that I've only discovered maybe 5 months ago. It was probably already a thing before I discovered it, but I felt so proud of myself when I did discover it. It was what I like to call unofficial tile protection. And that's because oftentimes when you're using the Orchid, you're not going to capture a tile with it if there's a tile right there that can capture your Orchid after that, because that's basically just like throwing away your queen, in a game of chess.
right.
You don't want to do that. But if the only way for them to capture your Orchid after you capture a tile, if the only way for them to do that means that it gives you the opportunity to win the next move after that, that gives your Orchid unofficial protection, because technically it can be captured. But if it gets captured, it makes it so that you can win. And so oftentimes it's a really good idea to think, should I just go for this? And then they're kind of stuck between either letting my Orchid keep going on a killing spree or letting me win. And obviously they don't want to let you win. So that's an awesome predicament to put someone in.
These trade-off situations also help with, threatening to capture a tile. If your opponent moving their tile out of range lets you win, then you're basically forcing them to allow themselves to be captured. And so those sort of trade-offs are very good to play with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so let's see, we've talked about the tempo, basic strategy, openings. We've talked about basic flower tiles, special flower tiles, accent tiles, and I think we've kind of covered everything we should cover for Skud strategy. Is there anything else you guys would like to bring up?
Don't think so. And that's just general. Obviously, there's so much more to it, but that's like a pretty good overview, I think.
Yeah. It can just keep getting deeper and deeper.
The one recommendation I can make overall for any newer player is play aggressive. And I don't mean throw out accent tiles right away. I mean play offensively. Don't let yourself sort of submit to who you think is a more skilled opponent by just sort of defending and sort of losing hope of making a win. Play aggressively. Try to sneak past them. Never give up in a game of Skud, because it's not like chess where you have those super limited resources. It's not like Vagabond in that way either. You can always find a way to pull the advantage back your way. So play aggressively and don't give up.
Very true words, very wise. And okay, so I guess we'll wrap up the podcast here. Some things, a little off topic, but on the topic of our podcast. I think it's time that we chose our podcast logo.
Oh, that's right.
So, here's an idea I had. We could we put up a poll. I contacted Sir Stoats because he's a very prominent tile designer. Usually he designs a lot of tiles for the site on the Discord.
He's a very good graphic artist.
Yeah, if he can do that kind of stuff, he can probably make us a logo. So I asked him to give us some options, and he gave me more than I expected. And then Sambews and I couldn't decide on which one to make the logo, so we put them up for a poll in the server, and I just came to the server now, and it looks like logo option 1 has the most votes as of this moment. So should we go with that one?
I mean, I think so.
Alrighty. I'll put that in post. I'll put it up on the screen right there so you can see what that is. And by the time this comes out, we'll probably have that as our logo. So that's very cool.
All right, congrats on having that.
I think we still need a name. So if you have suggestions, DM us at... We made a Discord account for this. It's called, like... It's called something.
It is good to remember what it is.
What is it called? Oh, you put it in pins.
It's called Paicast. Paicast.
All right.
So feel free to DM us names, because I don't want Paicast to be our name forever.
If by chance you happen to be watching this or listening to this and you have not joined the official Garden Gate Discord server, I highly recommend you do. It's probably one of the only ways you'll be able to properly contact any of us, and you will be able to. We're all frequently online. I'm one of the most active players, and I know that both Dallin and Sambews are almost always happy to talk. So please do join. It's a fantastic place. Everyone's very kind and respectful, and we look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got strategy covered. We've got a new logo, and we're asking for suggestions on our name. And I think that I wrap it up for this episode. Thank you, everybody, so much for watching this episode 2 of the Pai Sho Podcast, for lack of a better name. And we'll see you next time.
Alright. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Oh, yeah. I feel like that went...